result in instances where Eurocentric models of museology are imposed onto museums in the region through international policy and partnerships, rather than models generated out of localized practice and a profound absence of Caribbean voices influencing the development of global museology. One of the founding principles of MAC that has been consistent throughout the last 3 decades, is to provide a platform for undertaking significant research and publish our own museology, speaking back to the global north and emphasizing our position as key stakeholders and contributors to international museum development. Our panelists today are going to share the process and findings of 2 projects. Nyasha Warren, education researcher at the Museo del Canal, and Elizabeth Hines, tour guide at the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, will be sharing MAC's research project on how COVID-19 has impacted Caribbean museums. This project aligned with ICOM's global efforts to map the impact of national lockdowns and major policy revisions regarding access to public spaces on museums and heritage centres. Some of the questions arising from this research included: how can the Caribbean take ownership of its own crisis narrative? What is the role in museums in facilitating the understanding of collective experience through the pandemic? The multivocal approach of the COVID-19 survey has also been reflected in the Caribbean's role within ICOM museum definition processes. Katerina Jacobson, archaeologist and collections management at the Museo Departamental Edgar Clerc in Guadeloupe, and Adelisa Gonzalez Lugo, executive director and lead educator at the Fundación Cortés, will share the process and findings from the MAC subcommittee for accessing Caribbean definitions of the museum, which was led by Dr. Shani Roper and consisted of 10 colleagues from throughout the region. This research fed into the ICOFOM LAC project, Latin American and Caribbean Perspectives on a New Museum Definition, and ultimately contributed to the ICOM Define process, which we heard a little bit about on Wednesday night. This involved collating bibliographic resources, conducting focus groups and interviews, and developing a published paper. And some key questions for this subcommittee during the process included: who is defining museum decolonization in ICOM, and who is outlining the success criteria for it? What is the sustainability of these findings for a new museum definition on a regional and international level? These projects examine research advocacy as a continual reflexive process in museology, questioning if there can be possibilities to really democratize museums and consider them platforms to address issues of citizenship that are still prominent in our Caribbean post-colonial or neo-colonial realities. So without further delay, I'd like to invite Nyasha and Elizabeth to get the ball rolling and share the COVID-19 survey.
Okay. All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. It's really great to be here and have this kind of culmination of a lot of work on this table. I can't explain. Research is something that takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of work. It's not always sexy. It doesn't always give those beautiful, marketing designed results, but it's extremely valuable. And we need it in order to have data to be able to make informed decisions that are going to help us do whatever it is we're doing better, right? That's kind of the bottom line here. And there are many issues with research. Historically, when you think of the history of science, for example, who does the research also has an impact on what we get to learn and how accurate it really is. So we're really glad we can share with you today a little bit of what we did. So the MAC COVID-19 follow-up survey, it was a follow-up survey because we actually did one in 2020, April 2020. 20, we did the first one. And then a year later, a little bit after a year later, we did our second survey in which we decided instead of, ICOM had also done a survey. There were a few surveys going around and everybody was doing horribly in the pandemic. And this time around, we wanted to focus on, okay, what are we doing? It's been more than a year now after the pandemic, started, and we're kind of moving on. We know it's still around, but we do need to move on. And so our idea with this was to, in addition to see how people were going just see what kind of strategies they may have come up with to deal with the situation. And of course, all of the information we gather will be shared with everybody, the respondents, as well as the community, the museum sector in the region, and internationally, as well as with ICOM and other organizations that we are able to collaborate with, and we've collaborated in the past. I'll tell you just a very quick about our methodology, our sample, and more or less what we got to what we found out in a very quick summary. And then very much on purpose, the data we're going to talk about is not in the form of graphs and tables, okay? Because another thing that we know we need to work on is how we communicate our findings to the rest of the community, right? We tend to talk to each other a lot. Researchers, we do that way too much. And even though I am going to say some percentages and things like that, we are going to work with some quotes. We are hoping to have you learn about these museums who completed our survey in their own voices, and then we'll intersperse some data within there. So we did an email survey, all right? An email survey to over 700 museums from our database. We did a lot of research online. We had another database as well. We tried to get as many as we could throughout the Caribbean, and especially trying to reach all 4 linguistic regions, yeah? And of those 700 and people we emailed, we got 46 responses. And I know that sounds like nothing, but I'm going to tell you something. I do surveys. Email surveys are the ones that have the lowest response rates. And just so you know, we had a response rate of 6%, and the usual rate is between 5 and 30%. And 30% is when you have manpower. We are an organization of volunteers, and we do the best we can, but that's also why it takes us longer to get things done, right? But we chugged along. We got approximately 40% response from the English Caribbean, 30% from Spanish-speaking Caribbean, 20% from the French-speaking Caribbean, and 10% from the Dutch-speaking Caribbean. And this was an email survey composed of over 60 questions, so that's the other thing. It's a challenge to get 46 people to answer a survey that's that long. Yeah, we achieved something. But this survey purposely included 13 open questions. These are questions that surveys normally tell us a lot about the what, the when, the who. But we wanted to know a little bit more about the how and the why. So we put in some open questions that would allow us to do a little bit of that, okay? And those questions focus mainly on knowing how museums were affected, what strategies they were looking at, and also what kind of professional development they'd be interested in having to help them continue doing what they're doing or doing it better. 42 of the 43 respondents who actually gave us permission to share their data answered these open questions, because another thing that will happen with a survey, most people will answer the quick ones, and the ones that ask you, tell me more about, no, we're not going to do that. So that's also, actually quite a feat, and we feel good that we got enough people also answering that. So we analyze not only the results, but just who is answering and how much, so that we can improve. And we noticed that most of our responses were from the English-speaking Caribbean, followed by Spanish-speaking Caribbean, followed by the French. That tells us, that in itself is information. We want to work to improve that. We want everybody to feel comfortable with what we put together. And the survey was in 4 different languages. Now, I can quickly just summarize that the answers that we got in those 13 open questions, right, pretty much fall into 3 categories: the perceived impact of the pandemic, the strategies developed to deal with it, and the perceived impact of the strategies. And those 3 groups that I just mentioned, I can just quickly tell you fall into things that you're not going to be surprised, right? Impact has the negative impacts of the pandemic had a lot to do with decreased visibility, all the things that impact how visible the museum is, financial issues, even ethical issues were mentioned, and lack of autonomy was something that came up, how we can make decisions about what we can do. The strategies that were mentioned fall into 6 different subgroups, but the top 3 were also things to increase visibility, obviously, things to increase financial strategies, but something else that came up a lot is increase knowledge base, right? Anything that could be done to increase knowledge base was definitely perceived as something that was a strategy that was helping them. Less frequent was community engagement, which is also important. Increase programs, whether they're school programs, public programs, workshops, and the sort. And ethics came up a few times, which is also very interesting for us. And last but not least, the impact of the strategy. Again, we're having these repeating trends, visibility, financial impacts, knowledge base, and then community. So we're hearing these repeating patterns, which it might sound like, oh, but it's the same thing. No, it's good that it's the same thing, because I just came from a ICOM listening session, and these are terms that are being repeated throughout. So it's good to know, it's good for me to feel like, okay, we did this survey. Mind you, this survey, I should have said this from the very beginning, this is what we call a convenience sample. What this means is I send out an email to a bunch of people, but the only people who answer it are the ones that decide to answer it. So in research, a lot of times what we want to have is a representative sample. That means that I have a census, and I randomly select a certain percentage, and then I try to get that percentage to answer. And that way I know that that represents everything. It's much more difficult to do. It takes a whole lot more time. We have the capacity to do this kind of sample, where we send it out to as many people, and then we accept whomever chooses to answer, yeah? So, moving on, my colleague Elizabeth is going to go through a few quotes that are simply good examples of some of the comments that we mostly got in the survey in those open questions. We're going to focus a lot more on the open ones to give us a little bit more information. So we can go to the 2 more slides down. There, the next one, and the next one. All right. Yeah.
All right. So as Nyasha would have stated, our knowledge-based strategies would have been the ones that would have been most frequently responded about in the survey. A lot of these strategies would have focused on particularly the training of museum staff, as well as particularly when it comes to being able to manage situations like COVID and other situations that might put their museum at risk. So they focused a lot on the building of skills that would be needed for such crisis periods, revamping of contingency plans. There was also changing how resources were used at the museum, particularly when it comes to social media. We actually would have had one part of the survey that evaluated what social media platforms were in use during, I should say, before the pandemic, and specifically what they were used for, and then looking at what they were used for during the pandemic and what platforms saw an increase. Actually, with this particular section, we did see that Facebook and Instagram were the ones leading before the pandemic, though they would have been focused primarily on marketing. However, when we move into the pandemic, it's the same 2 platforms that are the most used, which is Facebook and Instagram. Facebook at the top, then Instagram closely following that. However, we have them being shifted to use for other purposes. For example, some museums use it for education. I believe everyone here is familiar with Facebook Live. A lot of people started putting their seminars up on their workshops, training. They were also able to gain funding through that because they could have persons pay for the workshop, so that assisted in terms of impacts of finance, which we are going to talk about later on in the slides. But basically being able to revamp these resources that they did have before, that was another way of sort of knowledge-based strategies that they had. Even learning to use these platforms, because not every person in your museum is going to know the different aspects that other members of the museum are capable of. So particularly when we have situations, for example, where you're not able to hire new staff for specific resources that you need, you have staff learning these new skills, and that's also falling into knowledge-based strategies as well. We have improvement in basic skills, which we would figure that we're working on that already, but some of them also had to be revamped specifically for the situation. You have more knowledge for health and safety, which again, most museums have a basic in that already, but of course we have new protocols specifically for the pandemic, and even coming out of the pandemic, things shifted again. So that's just to give you an idea of what was done. On top of that, we do have increase in access to these digital resources. We did ask persons if they had created new digital resources as well. A lot of persons would have actually focused on online exhibitions and then increasing their digital collections online as well. I can say personally that MAC would have done the same thing. Some of you might know about the In Conversation series that we would have had. We even had an online art space where you could actually go and visit an exhibition, but it's in virtual reality. So these are things that would have incorporated and that we would have had to learn. It was very interesting, and I would say that we at least had fun learning these new techniques, but that's just something that we were incorporating. You can go to the next slide for me, please. Yes, so we do have the community outreach as another strategy that we would have had. It wouldn't have been as high up a priority as the knowledge-based strategies, but it's something that would have become vital to certain museums. Basically, when we have the shutdown, a lot of museums would have been heavily dependent on tourists coming into their institutions. So when we have the lockdowns, basically that cut into their earnings very badly. So those museums that would have had basically a structure where they have tourists as the most not appealing, but the audience that they're going after the most, then they would have school groups, and then they would have locals somewhere at the bottom there. So a lot of them had to find a way to sort of flip that so that they're now going for the locals and having them involved in the museum and having them invested in the museum so that they're still focused enough that their museums are not in crisis. Some museums were actually fortunate enough to already have that strategy in place. From my museum back home, we definitely had locals as being the focal point. And then if we got tourists, that's a nice addition at different points during the year. And that was meant to basically not have a decrease in traffic when we have on and off seasons. But it really helped us when it came to COVID-19. We, for example, sort of based our bus tours in particular around Barbadian habits, or some things that Barbadian characters that we were known for. So we very much are people that will hop in our car on weekends and just drive around the country looking for odd spots and exploring. The museum capitalized on that. So even when COVID happened, we had guests calling in, when are you going to do the bus tours? We're waiting to do the bus tours. We have nothing to do. And they're literally stalking the social media to see when the bus tours are coming up. And we had to apply a strategy because before that we called our bus tours island excursions, which sounds like a fun adventure thing. And the government was really not about having anything fun going on because of the spread of COVID. We rebranded and called them educational tours. And since it fell under education, they allowed us to go through with the tours. So that actually sort of brought back the flow. And because we already had that relationship in the community, basically as soon as we opened the doors and said, yes, we're doing the bus tours, we basically were able to start the flow. And we even had hires during the pandemic, which I know is a completely different experience from other persons. Now, the next slide is actually going to deal with financial impacts, negative financial impacts, unfortunately, when it comes to the pandemic. So as you can see, this one in particular is looking at cutbacks with staff. There's also a mention of funding and how lack of it would have led to some of our museums either closing temporarily, hopefully in some instances, but we are aware that there's some museums that from the very beginning of the pandemic, they were saying that already there's not a lot of emphasis on our museum. If it closes now, it's not opening back. And we did try to maintain open communication with them so we can see how they're doing, but we would have collected responses not just from them but other museums talking about the impact. So for example, again, connecting back with the community outreach and more focus on tourism and tourists coming in, suddenly not having that market meant that of course they're taking a large hit financially. Some of them had to not just cut staff but also figure out what essential and non-essentials they were cutting. So on top of not necessarily being able to do things that would maintain the building, they might not have been able to pay for water, they might not be able to pay for electricity. Wi-Fi was also an issue, so a lot of staff couldn't go to work anymore. They had to stay home and work from their Wi-Fi connections there, which meant also there's not a lot of oversight on those heritage places either. So a lot of them were impacted in terms of the structure because persons were not there to look after them anymore. And it sort of connected to ethical issues too, because now they're not able to protect these sites by going out or even being on premises to work there. So there was reports of heritage loss connected to the financial issues as well. So we do have strategies that people were trying to put in place. For example, trying to learn better budgeting, figuring out what is essential and what is not essential for your museum to work. But again, a lot of these negative impacts basically affected them even coming out of the pandemic as well. This is the point where I'm going to hand over to Nyasha.
How much time we have? All right, before concluding our section, thank you. Before concluding our section, we're just gonna look at 2 more slides that have to do with, in this case, we're thinking a little bit about technology, but also education as well. And this is mainly just to put in a bit of a reminder. There's another quote I'm going to relate to this one. We definitely have involved ourselves in using much more technology, digital resources for educational purposes. However, part of this work of doing educational activities is trying to understand what is that impact, right? So one thing is to be able to say how many people you got, how many students you got, but then what is the impact on those students? I say that just to mention only one of the respondents actually mentioned evaluation, to know how your strategies are going or how your everything is working. And that is a rare answer, but that really brings up a topic that is important, right? So that's why I kind of bring it up in conjunction with this one. Digital resources and education are something that we're going to be doing more and more of, but that one person, that one museum respondent that said evaluation, it kind of reminds us all that, ooh, that is actually, for us as MAC, that is a flag. So we know that when we're thinking of other things we need to do in the future to create resources for others, that should be in the list, even though it wasn't numerous as far as responses, okay? And then we can go to the next one. And this was another rare respondent that actually was able to talk about a positive impact of strategy that they were using. They were able to lobby for others who did not have funding. And I like ending with this slide because it talks about exactly what we're talking about here, right? The power of museums. If we have the resources, if we have the knowledge, we can actually lobby for others. And that is what we're doing. That's what we're kind of doing. We're here together, we're networking, and we're going to see how we can all help each other with resources, with knowledge, experiences, and so forth. And now, just to conclude, that's my last slide, but to conclude, just kind of bringing it all together again and linking it to that main question that you read in our abstract, right? We're looking at the role and the challenges of research to inform advocacy and shape programs in museums, right? All the stuff that we're doing, we want it to be useful for others. Our role is what I said at the beginning. We want to gather data that's reliable to inform decisions that we're making in all these different areas that we need to work on. The challenges, and as MAC we feel them, the challenges of doing this research, and not only MAC feels them, even research institutions at different levels feel this depending on how much resources they have. First, and I'll talk about our specific examples in this one, gathering the data, deciding which method to use. What human resource do I really have? We had to go with email because we only had the capacity to send an e-blast to 700 people. Yeah, that's good, that's not bad. If you do that on Google from your email, it's not going to work. It's all going to go to spam. So we have the e-blast capacity. But then you need to get enough numbers, right? My ideal would have been to get at least 30 responses from each linguistic region. That gives me a number that is a little, higher in order to make it a little bit more significant, right? We need it to be statistically significant. And then, as I said before, the next challenge gathering data that has representative information. So if we had a census of all the museums in the Caribbean, and I could say, give me that list of however many thousands of museums, and I can randomly select 10% of those, and then send them the survey, I know that my responses will truly represent the region. I would probably stratify it and say, okay, we're going to send it to the medium museums, small museums, large museums. We would do a little bit of that to make sure we're not just clumping everybody in the same group. But we don't have the capacity to do that. But we know that that would be a better way. We'd get different and more useful information as well. And then last but not least, something that I think the next group that's going to talk about has managed to do very well, and that is gathering data that uncovers unique characteristics, strengths, and needs of the museum sector and our community in general, the community that we serve, right? Even if they aren't in large numbers, right? Surveys deal with a lot of quantitative data. They give you numbers and you try to do something with it, but they're never enough. You need to be able to triangulate with something else. And I think focus groups, which we'll talk about next, help us get that deal a little bit more into the why and the how of all these numbers that we get. So I'll pass it over to my colleagues.
Yes, we can go to the other one. Okay. Then we will continue with the other project related to the museum definition, and I think you already made the summary. Then this project starts with the discussion of the new definition of the museum, and the association with the ICOM of Barbados create a subcommittee. Okay, yes. And the committee had members from Dutch, English, French, Spanish speaking Caribbean. Then for now, I will say that all of us, we were part of the group. And there was also Shani, Germaine Joseph from St. Lucia. We had Kay Hall, Katrina also, Ashley Morris from Trinidad, and Cara Rup Singh from Trinidad also, and Arminda, who is from Aruba, I don't know if she's there. Then the 12 of us, we were part of this subcommittee, and we have volunteers from different institutions of Jamaica, Barbados, the Bahamas, St. Lucia, Guadeloupe, Aruba, and we are all from different spheres: historian, curator, museologist, educator, and heritage professional. Then what was our methodology?
Our methodology included developing a methodological approach that centered the voices of museum professionals working in the region. Participatory action research will be the best approach to accessing practitioner perspectives.
Sorry.
It was funded, one of the focus group was funded by Fundación Cortés and also Fundación 1403 and the Prince Bernhard Cultural Fund Dutch Caribbean. Museums Association of the Caribbean and Local Voices, Guadeloupe, provided tech support by giving access to Zoom accounts to facilitate the focus groups. The research team selected focus groups and interviews as the research methodology with a people-centered approach in the languages spoken in the region, English, French, Spanish, and Dutch. Being the largest participating linguistic region, 5 small groups were held for the English Caribbean, while one focus group each was held for the other islands.
Yeah, too small. Less.
Well, you're small.
Yeah.
And it's fun to tell you that it was like this is a reunion for all of us. We had not seen each other in person throughout this entire process. And an organization of virtual focus groups to bridge geographical gaps between the islands.
Then in the focus group, we decide to ask 4 questions. Then what is a museum? What is not a museum? And then the traditional role of museum is to safeguard and promote material of culture, religious and historical importance. What additional function does your museum perform in your community? And finally, what are the new trajectory in Caribbean museum practices? But before to switch, yes, before to switch to the results, we will present our focus group results from the Spanish and after me for the French group.
Yes. So the Spanish focus group consisted of 12 participants between the ages of approximately 25 to 70 years old. The generational component, as well as the racial, nationality, gender, and specialty area.
And say, okay, our voice in the Caribbean also is matters. And yes, but it's not like just talking. We have proof of what we are saying, and we can contribute because, you know, academia, yeah, it's important in empty space. Then, yes, I think we did a fantastic job.
So through our very brief Through our very brief presentations, in terms of capturing some of the results, I think we've also given a glimpse into the ethos of our methodologies for both of the projects that really stem from particularly Caribbean ways of knowing that often, you know, aren't repeated throughout the global north. What we would love to do now is just bring everyone into the discussion. So Yvonne, if it's okay, I think we should jump straight into any questions or any comments, feedback that any of you may have from these. I'll just leave this.
Please raise your hand and I'll pass you the mic.
Hi, thank you for the presentation and for this wonderful effort with the survey. Can you talk about how you selected the questions that you used for the focus group, those 4 or 5 questions that you selected? Was there any particular challenges about how you would word them, etc.?
How many questions did we have?
We had, what were the questions? I remember that one of the first questions was, okay, what is a museum? And I remember saying, we should ask what it's not. It's always to think about, it's like the devil's advocate.
And that was one of the hardest questions that we had people, because everyone knows what they believe a museum is. Everyone knows what they believe a museum is, but then when you ask them, what is not a museum? Because a lot of what we consider museums has expanded, especially since it's now including different aspects of history. So that we did have some trouble with people trying to answer that question.
If I can add in terms of how we came up with those questions, I think it was a lot of workshopping with the subcommittee itself, but also referencing the wider methodology that was being developed by MAC-ICOM Define, that committee. So they were always very transparent about the process in which they were hoping national ICOM committees would be generating some of the data for the new museum definition. And I think what we were doing as a subcommittee, we're saying, okay, well, the questions that they're asking, which ones are relevant to our communities or to us as museum professionals? How can we rework these? And I think the what is not a museum came out of, those discussions. So we were kind of looking to the wider process, but also not just absorbing kind of instructions, if that makes sense. Really working around how we can present it to our own networks and communities here.
If I may add that with the Spanish focus group, they were thrilled to actually continue something. Like this was like they felt so special that they were participating in this focus group and they want more. They want, don't push me. They really, like it was something that if they all felt, and they were they had all levels of, as I mentioned, but they want to do more with this. Like they want to be involved, they want to be called upon and submit people region-wide. So it also helped people increase the Caribbean pride, the sense of we are Caribbean, we're big, and so there's so much to explore, there's so much to share. But the eagerness to continue this was, I think, to me, fascinating.
I think we all had. I think we all had the same conclusion. Everyone I know in the French group, they were like, when will be the next session? We need to continue, even if it's not with MAC, but we need to exchange with people talking the same language, having the same issues, because even us, we are from, the same institution with those local council, and we deal with the same French law that are not applicable for the Caribbean, and we are like, that's just the beginning, and we realize with the focus group that that's something we need to work with MAC. It's how to help those dialogues to be to continue, yes, in between us first and after in a wild region.
Absolutely. This is not the end result. This is more like a platform or a stepping stone for everyone to engage in, build research in your own communities, and add to the continuing conversation.
Tasha and then Alex.
Quick question. What role did artists play in this conversation?
Tasha.
I mean,
Artists.
You want to answer?
So this is just from a Caribbean and particularly a Barbadian perspective. Our artists tend to have a linkage to our museums, so you're going to find a lot of overlapping between museum spaces and artist spaces in Barbados. So actually, one of the persons that from the English respondents to the interview, she actually is a curator of the Queen's Park Gallery back home. Her degree is in museum design, but she is an art curator, and a lot of these spaces sort of, I don't want to say lumped together, because that's being unfair to the artists themselves, but work together is a good way of putting it. So a lot of what we are talking about also fell in. And of course, we do have the historic aspects of art in a lot of our countries as well. So generally speaking, they also contributed to helping us define what is a museum space, and they also would have done it on the part of artists and how they fit into those spaces as well.
I want to add something. It's maybe, I realize that I may have to decolonize my mind myself also, because when I choose for the French focus group, I didn't think of the artist in the way that I'm not coming from an art museum. And always the art museum have more voices than the other type of museum. Then for me, that was not, something in mind. Because yes, the other museum, the eco museums, museum of society, they are less represented, and but that's a good question. But to do the focus group, we had different challenges, because you had to find people, because you have people who are good in their job, but when they have to talk, it's like no, they can't, or they don't want to be in group, and you have people who will talk too much. No, but yeah, you need to find a balance. Otherwise, it's like two people will talk in the focus group and not the other one. Then it's not fair, and that's not what we want. We want everyone to give their position, and I know that I found plenty of interesting people, but they were like, I will not.